My name is Cole Durham. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years honing my expertise as a senior financial analyst at Monroe Technologies. My professional focus has always been forensic audits and financial compliance, areas where precision, thorough documentation, and unwavering integrity are non-negotiable. Over the years, I've developed a reputation for being meticulous in tracking financial flows, identifying irregularities, and ensuring that every transaction complies with both internal policies and regulatory standards. This isn't just a job for me. It's a discipline rooted in methodical investigation and data-backed truth. That evening, Monroe Technologies held its annual Halloween party, a corporate tradition attended by about 85 employees, their partners, and a few select clients. The event was designed as a casual celebration, a chance for everyone to unwind and connect beyond the confines of their roles. I had come dressed as a knight, complete with a full costume, including a polished helmet, chainmail accents, and a sword prop that fit the theme. It was a light-hearted touch, meant to engage with colleagues in a setting far removed from spreadsheets and audit trails. The atmosphere was festive, with carved pumpkins, themed cocktails, and everyone mingling beneath soft orange lighting. As the evening progressed, I was chatting with a few members of the finance team, exchanging brief updates about upcoming projects and compliance initiatives. The mood was relaxed, and for a moment it felt like the typical company party where hierarchy blurred and camaraderie took center stage. Then, unexpectedly, the room's energy shifted dramatically. Martin Whitaker, our CFO and my direct superior, stepped up to the microphone to address the crowd. His tone was casual, almost dismissive, but charged with a palpable undercurrent of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martin began, scanning the room with a smirk, "I have a special announcement to make." The guests, caught off guard, quieted down, turning their attention fully to him. "Cole Durham," he said, voice loud enough to carry, "You're fired, effective immediately." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room broke into a mix of stunned silence and awkward laughter. A few colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether this was a prank or a serious public dismissal. Martin's laughter echoed as he repeated, "You're fired, effective now," emphasizing the finality, as if this public spectacle was some kind of triumph or inside joke. I could feel the eyes of 85 guests on me, the buzz of whispered speculation filling the air. Despite the humiliation being staged so deliberately, I kept my composure. This was not the place for emotional reactions. It was a moment for strategic clarity. I responded simply and deliberately, "Understood." No hesitation, no defensiveness, just a calm acknowledgement. I stepped back, then reached into my costume's leather satchel, retrieving a manila folder I'd prepared earlier that afternoon. The folder was thick, bulging with documents, detailed expense reports, email threads, audit logs, all compiled meticulously over months. I held it up, so it was visible to the crowd. "Before I go, HR should review your expense reports," I said evenly but firmly. The room fell instantly silent. Conversations stopped, laughter died, and the festive lights seemed to dim under the weight of those words. In that moment, it was clear this wasn't just an impulsive reaction to being fired. It was a calculated professional statement. The folder was my armor, my evidence against the very person who had just publicly humiliated me. I had spent years building a body of work that protected the company's financial integrity. Now, I was formally raising the first flag on what I suspected was a serious breach of that trust. The silence hung for a long beat as the implications sank in. Martin's smirk vanished, his confident posture faltered. Around us, colleagues exchanged uncertain glances, some stepping closer to listen, others pulling out phones, likely to record this unprecedented moment. The HR manager, Laura Simmons, stood quietly nearby, her expression unreadable, caught between loyalty to the executive team and procedural obligation. I folded the folder carefully and placed it on the party table beside me. Then, without further comment, I turned and walked away. My exit was measured. No dramatic flourish, no anger. Just the steady certainty of someone who knew that the next steps would unfold in boardrooms, legal offices, and compliance departments, far from the noisy Halloween party. That night, beneath the costumes and the laughter, the gears of a much larger, more consequential process had already begun to turn. Since joining Monroe Technologies back in 2011, my career trajectory was defined by a deliberate commitment to rigorous financial oversight and forensic auditing. Over these 12 years, I consistently led comprehensive audits that uncovered inefficiencies and financial irregularities, which in aggregate resulted in cost savings exceeding $15 million for the company. This wasn't just about trimming expenses. It was about reinforcing Monroe Technologies' financial integrity and compliance posture at every level. Each audit was approached with the mindset of a detective, piecing together transactions, scrutinizing approvals and validating supporting documentation. My expertise lies heavily in forensic accounting, a specialized field that requires not only technical proficiency with complex enterprise resource planning, ERP systems, but also an acute understanding of corporate policies and regulatory frameworks. I became proficient in leveraging the company's ERP system, not just as an operational tool, but as a forensic resource. The system's audit trails, timestamps, and approval workflows were critical in tracking financial movements and identifying anomalies that standard audits might overlook. Recognizing that fraudulent activities often hide behind procedural gaps, I routinely cross-referenced expense reports with email communications, vendor contracts, and purchase orders, all backed up by encrypted digital archives to preserve evidentiary integrity. My role evolved into one of both strategist and guardian. I didn't merely identify issues, I documented them methodically, maintaining detailed records of each audit finding, correspondence, and corrective recommendations. This documentation was not about bureaucracy, it was about creating an unassailable chain of evidence that could withstand internal scrutiny and external regulatory challenges. Every finding was supported by time-stamped emails or system logs, ensuring that the audit trail was verifiable and transparent. Such meticulous record-keeping became my professional hallmark, distinguishing me as a reliable resource within Monroe Technologies and among external auditors. Over the years, my efforts also led to uncovering several compliance gaps that, if left unaddressed, could expose the company to regulatory penalties or reputational damage. These ranged from inconsistent approval processes to incomplete documentation of travel and vendor expenses, as well as lapses in adherence to internal financial controls. Addressing these issues required not only identifying them, but collaborating across departments, finance, procurement, legal, and HR to strengthen policies and enforce compliance. My reports often included actionable recommendations that were presented to senior management and compliance officers, accompanied by precise data visualizations and risk assessments. These contributions did not go unnoticed. I earned 2 promotions during my tenure, moving from junior analyst roles to my current senior position, which carries responsibilities for overseeing complex audits and mentoring junior analysts in best practices. However, with visibility came vulnerability. My deep dives into financial records occasionally brought me into conflict with executives whose actions I questioned. Particularly, my involvement in scrutinizing travel and vendor expenses increasingly put me at odds with certain individuals higher up the ladder. My insistence on transparency and accuracy made me a valuable asset, but also a perceived threat to those operating in the shadows. Throughout, I maintained a professional demeanor, never allowing personal feelings to cloud my judgment or reports. The culture of Monroe Technologies prized results and integrity, but navigating office politics was always a subtle challenge. I relied on the strength of my evidence and the clarity of my communication to protect my position. My records included encrypted backups and mirrored copies of all crucial files, ensuring that no single source could be tampered with without detection. This approach was not just about self-preservation. It was about safeguarding the company's financial health and upholding the trust placed in my role. In meetings, I was known for my precise presentations, breaking down complex audit findings into clear, actionable insights. I routinely collaborated with IT specialists to analyze ERP data logs, ensuring that no irregularities went unnoticed. These efforts were instrumental in supporting Monroe Technologies' internal controls and external audit processes, positioning the company as a model for financial compliance in our sector. In summary, my tenure at Monroe Technologies was defined by a dual commitment: delivering substantial financial oversight that saved millions and creating a robust, documented framework that underpinned the company's commitment to integrity. This foundation was critical to understanding the gravity of the events that unfolded that fateful Halloween evening, as the very systems and processes I had built and protected became the instruments for exposing a much deeper betrayal. Martin Whitaker had served as Monroe Technologies' CFO for the past 5 years, a role that placed him squarely at the helm of the company's financial decision-making during a complex period. The pressure on him had been mounting steadily. Monroe's revenue growth had stagnated for nearly 2 consecutive fiscal years, and the board's expectations for aggressive cost-cutting to maintain investor confidence were relentless. Whitaker's challenge was to demonstrate fiscal discipline without compromising operational integrity. However, beneath this public veneer of financial stewardship, I uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior that would ultimately expose his true priorities. Over an 18-month span, Whitaker orchestrated a deliberate scheme to inflate travel and vendor expenses by approximately $240,000. This was not a matter of mere bookkeeping errors or oversight. It was a calculated manipulation designed to siphon company funds under the guise of legitimate business costs. The falsifications involved submitting inflated receipts, fabricating vendor invoices, and manipulating expense report approvals to conceal the irregularities. His method was sophisticated enough to evade cursory reviews, but not the kind of forensic scrutiny my audits were built to uncover. Whitaker cleverly exploited his position and the organizational hierarchy to facilitate this fraud. As CFO, he wielded significant influence over expense approval workflows within the Enterprise Resource Planning (ERP) system, which governed financial transactions and enforced internal controls. Normally, expense reports, especially those submitted by executives, required documented approvals routed through multiple tiers, with automated audit trails preserved within the ERP. However, Whitaker bypassed these safeguards by either altering approval statuses or relying on complicit lower-level managers who rubber-stamped his submissions without proper review. Despite his apparent confidence, Whitaker made a critical miscalculation. He underestimated the comprehensiveness of my documentation practices and the depth of my knowledge regarding both the ERP system's audit capabilities and the company's internal policies. Over the years, I had systematically collected and cross-verified email correspondence, time-stamped transaction logs, and detailed audit reports that collectively formed a verifiable trail of financial activity. I was acutely aware of the policies mandating CFO expense approvals and the necessity for transparent documentation, policies designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation Whitaker attempted. Whitaker's plan to remove me was a direct response to my increasing scrutiny of the travel and vendor expense line items. My audits had begun raising red flags about inconsistencies in approval timestamps and discrepancies between submitted receipts and vendor contracts. Recognizing that I was the only analyst equipped to trace these irregularities back to him, he orchestrated my public dismissal with the intent of silencing my inquiries and sending a clear warning to others who might challenge him. To further mask his scheme, he aimed to replace me with a junior accountant at roughly half my salary, someone less experienced and less likely to question irregularities in executive expenses. An additional layer of complexity emerged with Laura Simmons, the HR manager, who played an unwitting but crucial role in this scenario. When Whitaker informed her of my termination, she complied with the directive without initiating any independent review or requesting evidence for the dismissal. Her adherence to procedure without critical inquiry effectively enabled Whitaker to circumvent HR's gatekeeping functions. The HR policies in place required a thorough assessment of any personnel actions linked to financial misconduct allegations, yet Laura deferred entirely to the CFO's authority, inadvertently compromising the procedural safeguards intended to protect employees and the company alike. From a strategic standpoint, Whitaker's machinations exposed fundamental weaknesses in Monroe Technologies' internal control environment, weaknesses that, ironically, my audits had flagged, but which remained unaddressed due to the concentration of power within the CFO's office. His exploitation of the expense approval system was emblematic of a broader cultural issue where executive privilege sometimes overshadowed formal compliance mechanisms. However, his failure to account for my forensic expertise and the encrypted backups I maintained meant that his fraudulent activities were far from invisible. This scenario underscored a professional paradox. The very systems and policies designed to assure financial accuracy and ethical conduct became tools for concealment when manipulated by those in authority. Whitaker's overconfidence in his ability to evade detection by sidelining a senior analyst like myself was his critical oversight. In reality, the intersection of technology, policy, and methodical audit work formed an impervious net that, once engaged, would leave little room for concealment. In the days leading up to the Halloween party, I had sensed a palpable shift in the executive team's behavior. Subtle evasions in meetings, and an unusual increase in approvals being fast-tracked without documentation. This aligned with the timing of Whitaker's attempts to finalize the replacement hire. It was clear that my role as a senior analyst, combined with my forensic audit capabilities, posed a significant threat to his concealment strategy. The public firing was as much a tactical move intended to undermine my credibility and deter further scrutiny as it was a personal vendetta. In sum, Whitaker's fraudulent inflation of expenses was a calculated effort driven by personal gain and pressured performance expectations. The scheme's sophistication relied on exploiting procedural gaps and compliance dependencies, but ultimately faltered against my detailed tracking, the ERP's immutable audit logs, and the internal audit policies that mandated CFO expense approvals. The complicity of HR's procedural compliance without critical analysis further exposed systemic vulnerabilities. This intricate, high-stakes professional conflict set the stage for the methodical unraveling that would follow in the subsequent phases of my response. After the abrupt announcement at the Halloween party, I needed to immediately ground myself in facts rather than emotions. Once I returned home, I carefully unpacked the termination letter that had been handed to me moments before walking out. The letter was terse and formal, citing performance issues without specifics, an unsurprising but disingenuous justification given the circumstances. The lack of detail was a red flag. It was clearly crafted to mask the real motive behind my dismissal. I then accessed my personal archival database, a secure repository I had maintained outside the company's network precisely for situations like this. Over the years, I had systematically saved every expense report, audit note, and email communication relating to financial transactions and operational approvals. This wasn't just habitual record-keeping, it was professional foresight, born from my forensic accounting background and knowledge of corporate fraud risks. As I began reviewing the documents, patterns quickly emerged. First, I located the expense reports Whitaker had submitted over the prior 18 months. Using my audit tools, I compared the submitted figures against vendor contracts, travel itineraries, and third-party confirmations. Several entries were inconsistent. Inflated vendor invoices showed dollar values higher than contract agreements, and travel expenses included duplicate reimbursements. One receipt, supposedly for a hotel stay, had discrepancies in dates when cross-referenced with booking confirmations. Next, I cross-examined the approval workflows embedded in the ERP system logs. Normally, expense reports pass through at least 2 levels of approval before reaching the CFO's final sign-off. However, Whitaker's reports had irregular timestamps. Approvals were logged simultaneously or out of sequence, indicating possible manipulation of the audit trail. ERP system metadata confirmed that some approvals were altered or backdated, a clear violation of internal controls and corporate policy. I also analyzed the email correspondence tied to these expense reports. Over months, I had preserved encrypted copies of exchanges between Whitaker, his assistants, and certain vendors. These emails showed that Whitaker instructed subordinates to expedite approvals and to avoid questions about certain charges. In one chain, dated 6 months prior, Whitaker requested an assistant to handle the paperwork quietly for an unusually large vendor payment. This language suggested deliberate concealment. Compiling these findings, I identified multiple breaches of fiduciary duty and instances of fraudulent financial reporting. The inflated expenses not only misrepresented Monroe Technologies' financial status to executives and shareholders, but also violated SEC regulations on accurate financial disclosure. Crucially, the ERP system tampering was a direct affront to the company's internal audit policies, which required that all CFO expenses be transparently approved and logged. I maintained a neutral analytical mindset throughout this review. There was no room for impulsive reactions or public accusations at this stage. My priority was to construct an airtight case based on verifiable evidence. The comprehensive documentation I possessed was my strongest asset. I pinpointed leverage points. The altered ERP audit logs were irrefutable proof of tampering, and the HR policies explicitly mandated investigation into any expense irregularities, a protocol that Laura Simmons had neglected when she accepted Whitaker's termination directive without review. This initial assessment confirmed that Whitaker's fraudulent activities were extensive and systemic. Moreover, his attempt to silence me via public termination had failed to account for my preparedness and methodical documentation. The next phase would require careful strategic planning to convert this evidence into actionable legal and regulatory pressure. But first, I needed to ensure that all data was secured and that I fully understood the scope and implications of the financial misconduct. In sum, this thorough review was not merely an inventory of wrongdoing. It was a diagnostic process, revealing the structural weaknesses that Whitaker exploited and the procedural lapses that allowed such fraud to persist. Identifying these gaps laid the foundation for the systematic measures I intended to pursue, leveraging corporate policy, regulatory compliance, and legal protections. This was the professional battlefield on which I would fight back, calmly, resolutely, and with a full arsenal of documented truth. After confirming the scope of the fraud and my abrupt termination's true nature, I knew I needed expert legal counsel, someone versed in both employment law and corporate fraud. That's when I arranged a meeting with Ethan Barnes, an employment lawyer I'd consulted briefly years earlier regarding contractual clarifications. Ethan specialized in wrongful termination cases involving complex financial misconduct and had a solid reputation for navigating corporate legal intricacies with precision and discretion. I contacted him immediately, providing a high-level overview of the situation and requesting an urgent appointment. When we met, I came prepared with my comprehensive documentation, printed copies of all expense reports flagged for irregularities, copies of altered approval workflows extracted from the ERP audit logs, and a curated selection of key email threads illustrating Whitaker's deliberate concealment tactics. I also brought the termination letter and excerpts from the employee handbook highlighting HR policies on expense report investigations and whistleblower protections. Ethan reviewed each element methodically, asking pointed questions to clarify timelines, internal reporting structures, and any prior attempts I had made to escalate these concerns internally. Together, we began cataloging the evidence with a forensic mindset. Ethan emphasized the importance of clear chain of custody for all documents to ensure admissibility in potential litigation or regulatory proceedings. We organized digital files by date and type and cross-referenced them against company policies and relevant SEC regulations regarding financial reporting. His meticulous approach mirrored my own, transforming my mountain of raw data into a structured dossier that laid bare Whitaker's scheme and Monroe Technologies' procedural failures. Parallel to evidence sorting, we drafted a timeline that emphasized Whitaker's gradual escalation of fraudulent expense claims over an 18-month period. This timeline included annotations indicating when I first spotted anomalies and how internal controls had failed to detect or prevent the misconduct. We identified critical leverage points, the altered ERP logs that could be independently verified by IT auditors, the HR policy violations stemming from Laura Simmons' failure to investigate, and the breach of fiduciary duties clearly punishable under corporate governance standards. Recognizing the complexity of the case, Ethan advised me to secure additional witness statements from colleagues who had noticed suspicious behavior or had been indirectly involved in approving irregular expenses. I reached out discreetly to trusted peers within finance and procurement, requesting written accounts of any unusual approvals or pressure to expedite expense submissions without proper checks. These statements, once verified, would supplement our dossier and demonstrate a pattern of systemic failure, not just isolated incidents. Concurrently, I ensured that all evidence, both physical and digital, was backed up securely. I created encrypted drives with multiple redundancies stored offline to prevent tampering or data loss. This step was crucial. Preserving the integrity of the evidence was paramount to sustaining legal action and regulatory complaints. It was a safeguard against potential attempts by company IT or legal departments to suppress or alter sensitive information. Our strategic plan coalesced around 3 parallel tracks. First, filing formal complaints with Monroe Technologies' Compliance Office to trigger internal investigations. Second, preparing submissions for external regulatory agencies, including the SEC, which oversees financial reporting standards. And third, drafting preliminary legal claims for wrongful termination and retaliation should the company seek to discredit or silence me further. Ethan outlined the procedural nuances of each track, emphasizing timelines, confidentiality requirements, and potential outcomes. Throughout this phase, I maintained professional discipline. Every communication, whether with Ethan, witnesses, or company representatives, was documented and archived. I refrained from making public statements or engaging in emotional responses, knowing that measured professionalism would strengthen my position. I also reviewed my employment contract with Ethan, identifying clauses that could serve as additional leverage, non-disclosure agreements, severance conditions, and protections against retaliation. Together, we developed a communication protocol to manage incoming inquiries from Monroe's HR and legal teams once the complaints were filed. Ethan prepared me to respond factually and succinctly, avoiding speculation or personal grievances. This approach was designed to preserve credibility and focus attention on the evidence rather than interpersonal conflicts. By the end of our initial working sessions, the once overwhelming pile of documents, emails, and spreadsheets had been transformed into a coherent, actionable case file. The path ahead was clear: systematically expose Whitaker's fraud through internal and external channels while protecting my legal rights and professional reputation. The careful groundwork laid during this strategic planning phase would be indispensable as the process advanced toward formal investigations and potential litigation. After our initial evidence review and strategic planning session, Ethan and I focused on building a legally airtight case that could withstand both internal company scrutiny and external regulatory examination. Ethan began by conducting a thorough analysis of my employment contract, paying particular attention to clauses that might protect me from retaliatory termination and provide avenues for compensation if wrongful dismissal was proven. These clauses included specific anti-retaliation provisions aligned with whistleblower protection laws, confidentiality agreements that allowed disclosure of fraud under certain conditions, and severance arrangements contingent on disputes over termination cause. His detailed reading reassured me that the contract was a strong foundation for our claims. We then turned our attention to assembling a comprehensive dossier, essentially a professional portfolio that would lay out the fraud in undeniable terms. This dossier was organized into distinct sections. First, the financial evidence, comprising the flagged expense reports with inflated amounts, duplicated vendor invoices, and travel reimbursements that didn't align with actual bookings. Each document was cross-referenced with its corresponding ERP audit logs, illustrating approval timestamps, system-generated flags, and metadata showing alterations or backdating. These logs were critical. They proved manipulation by highlighting discrepancies between electronic approvals and physical paperwork. Next, the email correspondence formed a narrative thread revealing intent and coordination. We selected key email chains where Whitaker gave instructions to assistants to expedite approvals or quietly handle paperwork, language that strongly suggested deliberate concealment. We also included emails from colleagues expressing concerns about irregular approvals or unexplained rushes in processing expenses. These communications supported the claim that the fraud was not a one-off error, but a systematic scheme. Ethan meticulously mapped these documents against Monroe Technologies' internal policies and external regulations. We highlighted breaches of corporate governance, especially violations of the company's audit and approval policies that mandated multiple tiers of review for CFO expenses. Our dossier pointed out how these policies were circumvented or ignored, implicating not only Whitaker's fraudulent activities, but also HR's procedural failure, specifically Laura Simmons' decision not to investigate or question the termination directive. This non-compliance with HR protocols became a significant liability in framing the company's response to the fraud. We also incorporated regulatory frameworks into our dossier. Ethan identified multiple violations under the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) guidelines, particularly concerning accurate financial reporting and internal controls. We underscored how Whitaker's actions distorted Monroe Technologies' financial disclosures, potentially misleading shareholders and regulators. To reinforce this, we obtained expert statements from IT auditors who analyzed the ERP system's log files and confirmed tampering, technical validation that strengthened our case beyond anecdotal or circumstantial evidence. Meanwhile, I reached out discreetly to colleagues who had witnessed or been indirectly involved in suspicious approvals. Their written statements provided corroborative evidence of a culture of expediency around expense reports and occasional pressure to overlook standard procedures. These testimonies were carefully documented, signed and dated, with verification of their authenticity to ensure they would be admissible in legal and regulatory proceedings. Anticipating potential counterarguments from company lawyers, Ethan insisted on maintaining strict chain of custody and data integrity protocols. We encrypted all electronic files, maintained tamper-proof physical copies of documents, and logged every interaction related to evidence handling. This level of rigor was essential to preclude any claims of evidence contamination or fabrication. The dossier's final section detailed a timeline of events spanning the 18 months of fraudulent activity, including when I first raised internal alarms and how management failed to act. This chronological narrative was bolstered by emails, system logs, and HR records, illustrating a pattern of misconduct and procedural neglect. Parallel to dossier assembly, Ethan drafted formal complaint templates targeting two primary recipients: Monroe Technologies' Compliance Office and external regulatory bodies, including the SEC. These complaints were structured to clearly state the allegations, present supporting evidence summaries, and request thorough investigations. We ensured the language was precise, professional, and devoid of emotional language, a calculated approach to maximize credibility and compel action. Throughout this process, Ethan advised me on communication strategies to preserve professional integrity. We rehearsed responses to potential company inquiries, emphasizing fact-based replies referencing the dossier. He cautioned against any public statements until regulatory investigations were underway, stressing discretion to avoid jeopardizing legal positions. By the end of this intensive phase, the dossier we assembled was not just a collection of suspicious documents, but a robust professional indictment of Whitaker's fraudulent conduct, Monroe Technologies' compliance failures, and a legally supported framework for pursuing wrongful termination claims. The combination of forensic accounting evidence, procedural policy breaches, regulatory violations, and witness corroboration formed a multidimensional case that would be difficult for the company or Whitaker to refute. This step was crucial. It transformed months of investigative work and discomfort into a structured offensive, positioning me squarely as a professional fighting for justice through systematic, documented channels rather than reactive confrontation. The groundwork we laid would drive the next phase, formally initiating complaints and engaging regulators, setting the stage for the unraveling of Whitaker's scheme and the company's reckoning with its internal governance failures. Once Ethan and I finalized the comprehensive dossier and aligned our legal strategy, I proceeded with the crucial next step, formally submitting a whistleblower complaint through Monroe Technologies' internal compliance channels. Despite the fraught circumstances following my abrupt termination, I adhered strictly to protocol to ensure that my actions would be recognized within the company's governance framework and to preserve the integrity of the process. I drafted the formal complaint meticulously, referencing specific sections of the employee handbook that outlined Monroe's whistleblower protections and compliance reporting procedures. The document summarized the fraudulent activities uncovered, specifically the $240,000 in inflated travel and vendor expenses orchestrated by Whitaker, and highlighted the procedural failures, including HR's neglect to investigate my termination and the internal audit policy breaches. I attached key exhibits from our dossier, such as copies of the altered expense reports, ERP audit logs demonstrating tampering, and excerpts from email communications showing Whitaker's deliberate efforts to conceal these irregularities. Submitting this complaint through the official compliance portal was a deliberate choice. It ensured that the report was logged with a time-stamped receipt and routed directly to the compliance office and designated internal investigators. I also sent parallel communications to Laura Simmons, the HR manager, requesting confirmation of receipt and emphasizing the importance of a thorough and impartial investigation consistent with company policy. I copied Ethan on all correspondence, maintaining a documented professional chain of communication that could be referenced in any subsequent legal proceedings. Simultaneously, given the severity of the financial misconduct and the potential regulatory implications, Ethan advised me to notify external authorities. We prepared and submitted a detailed report to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, outlining the nature of the fraud, the evidence supporting the allegations, and the company's failure to act internally despite explicit policies. The SEC submission included the dossier's financial audit evidence, system log analyses, and witness statements, ensuring the agency had sufficient grounds to initiate its own inquiry. This external notification was a critical escalation. It signaled that the issue was no longer confined to Monroe Technologies' internal governance, but raised concerns of public interest and regulatory compliance. I made sure the submission was factual and professional, avoiding any conjecture or inflammatory language to maintain credibility and facilitate an effective regulatory review. Parallel to these formal complaint filings, I managed ongoing communications with Monroe's HR and legal departments with discipline and restraint. When I received acknowledgements or inquiries, I responded succinctly and factually, referencing the documentation already on file and avoiding personal remarks. This approach reinforced my professional posture and kept the focus squarely on the evidence rather than subjective conflicts. Throughout this period, I maintained rigorous control of my evidence. I updated the encrypted backups, ensured secure storage of physical documents, and flagged any new information that emerged from initial compliance office feedback. This preparedness was essential to respond swiftly should the company attempt to challenge or dismiss my claims. While these processes unfolded, I also secured a consulting offer from a competitor, a Fortune 500 firm with a robust forensic auditing division. This offer validated my professional reputation and expertise, providing both a backup plan and additional leverage. I kept this development confidential, aware that premature disclosure could complicate ongoing negotiations or be used against me in internal disputes. Throughout, I maintained a measured demeanor. Despite the public humiliation at the Halloween party and the high stakes of the allegations, I consciously avoided emotional reactions or confrontations. This professionalism was strategic, preserving my credibility in the eyes of regulators, company leadership, and potential future employers. Meanwhile, within Monroe Technologies, Whitaker continued to project confidence and publicly touted his cost-cutting achievements. Unaware that the internal audit team and regulatory agencies had been alerted, he maintained a facade of control. However, behind the scenes, the wheels of investigation had been set in motion, and the formal complaints I submitted ensured that the Corporate Compliance Office and external regulators were now obligated to respond. In summary, this phase marked a pivotal transition from gathering and organizing evidence to actively engaging formal mechanisms of accountability. By adhering to prescribed reporting channels, involving regulatory authorities, and managing communications with professional discipline, I positioned my case to trigger the systematic unraveling of Whitaker's fraudulent scheme. The groundwork was laid for internal investigations and regulatory audits that would soon challenge the status quo at Monroe Technologies, transforming what began as a personal betrayal into a professional reckoning grounded in documented truth. Following the formal submission of the whistleblower complaint and regulatory notifications, the unfolding consequences inside Monroe Technologies became increasingly evident. Within days, the internal audit department initiated a detailed review of the flagged expense reports. Their initial findings aligned with the irregularities I had documented, and the discrepancies could no longer be dismissed as clerical errors or routine oversight. Auditors formally requested detailed explanations from Martin Whitaker regarding several suspicious entries totaling nearly $250,000. These inquiries were precise and technical, demanding supporting documentation, vendor contracts, and verification of approval workflows embedded in the ERP system. Whitaker's responses were noticeably evasive and inconsistent, an indicator that the deeper scrutiny was exposing vulnerabilities he hadn't anticipated. In several instances, he failed to produce the necessary corroborating documents or provided explanations that conflicted with logged data, raising further red flags among the audit team. Simultaneously, word began to spread discreetly beyond the finance department. Key clients with whom Monroe Technologies maintained substantial contracts reached out to senior account managers and executive leadership, expressing concern over the company's reported financial integrity. These clients demanded assurances that the firm's internal controls were robust and that financial statements remained trustworthy. The client inquiries added an external layer of pressure, signaling that the ramifications of the internal investigation were beginning to affect Monroe's market credibility and client confidence. Within the company, the ripple effects extended to Whitaker's replacement hire, the junior analyst brought in to fill my role. Lacking the experience and forensic expertise required to navigate complex audit demands, this analyst struggled to manage the workload effectively. Reporting delays and inaccuracies emerged, creating operational inefficiencies that further alarmed senior executives and internal compliance officers. The analyst's difficulties inadvertently highlighted the severity of the situation and underscored the void left by my abrupt dismissal. During this tense period, Martin Whitaker attempted to regain control of the narrative through direct communication with me. He reached out multiple times by email and phone, proposing informal resolutions and consulting arrangements, offers that, on the surface, appeared conciliatory, but were aimed at minimizing the fallout and silencing my pursuit of formal action. I responded with professional restraint, declining all overtures and directing him to channel any communications through my legal counsel, Ethan Barnes. This approach maintained clear boundaries and ensured all interactions were documented within a legal framework. Meanwhile, the atmosphere within the executive ranks shifted subtly but perceptibly. As auditors uncovered more evidence and regulatory inquiries loomed, whispers of concern replaced the earlier veneer of confidence. Whitaker's public demeanor of triumph at cost-cutting successes gave way to guarded caution. Meetings became more closed-door, agendas shifted toward damage control, and senior leaders began reassessing risk management strategies. Throughout this period, I maintained a disciplined professional posture, responding only with documented facts when required, and avoiding any emotional engagement. This measured approach preserved my credibility and ensured that the focus remained on the evidence and procedural correctness rather than personal conflict. It was clear that the systematic exposure of the fraud was beginning to unravel Whitaker's position from within, even as the outward appearance of business as usual persisted. The internal auditor's escalating focus, combined with client concerns and regulatory attention, signaled the opening moves of a comprehensive investigation. The stage was set for Monroe Technologies to confront significant governance challenges, and Whitaker's grip on his role was visibly loosening under the weight of methodical, documented scrutiny. The professional battlefield I had entered months earlier was now fully active, with every piece of evidence and every procedural misstep amplifying the momentum toward accountability. The situation escalated rapidly as multiple fronts converged against Martin Whitaker and Monroe Technologies. Within days of my formal whistleblower complaint and the SEC notification, Monroe Technologies found itself under the scrutiny of a formal Securities and Exchange Commission investigation. The SEC's involvement was a clear indicator that the allegations of $240,000 in fraudulent expenses were not just internal personnel disputes, but implicated serious violations of federal securities laws concerning financial reporting and disclosure. Simultaneously, the company's internal audit department ramped up its efforts, Their forensic accountants meticulously examined the flagged expense reports and cross-referenced them with ERP system audit trails, vendor contracts, and email communications. Their findings corroborated much of the evidence I had compiled. The audit report explicitly cited multiple instances of irregularities, including backdated approvals, inflated vendor invoices, and duplicated travel reimbursements. This internal confirmation added significant weight to the mounting case against Whittaker, placing Monroe Technologies in a compromised position that demanded immediate corrective action. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, I proceeded to file a civil lawsuit against Monroe Technologies and Whittaker, personally for wrongful termination, retaliation, and damages arising from the fraud exposure. My complaint detailed how Whittaker's calculated scheme not only violated fiduciary duties, but also targeted me specifically to suppress discovery of his misconduct. The lawsuit included extensive exhibits, detailed expense analyses, ERP system metadata, email correspondence demonstrating intent, and witness affidavits confirming pressure on approval processes. This legal action was structured to seek compensation for lost wages, damage to my professional reputation, and punitive damages for the retaliatory firing. As the regulatory and legal pressures intensified, Whittaker's stance began to falter. Internal communications leaked to me through trusted contacts indicated that he was exploring settlement offers with company leadership and through his personal counsel. These proposals included offers of monetary settlements and even reinstatement to his CFO position, attempts designed to halt proceedings before further damage ensued. However, through my attorney Ethan Barnes, I calmly declined all such overtures. We assessed that accepting any settlement without full accountability would undermine the broader goal of exposing the fraud and restoring corporate governance integrity. The SEC reinforced its posture by threatening fines that could exceed $500,000, reflecting the seriousness with which they regarded the financial misstatements and internal control failures. Monroe Technologies board was compelled to acknowledge the regulatory inquiry publicly, marking a significant reputational blow. Shareholders also became vocal, demanding transparency and swift action. Investor relations teams began preparing for potential damage control briefings as stock analysts downgraded their outlooks in light of the emerging scandal. Whittaker's professional credibility deteriorated steadily under the weight of this combined exposure. His previous image as a competent CFO dissolved into one marked by unethical conduct and governance failures. Board meetings increasingly centered on damage mitigation, with growing calls for leadership change. The internal audit team expanded their review to include other areas of financial management suspected of similar irregularities, suggesting that the initial $240,000 figure might only be part of a larger pattern. Throughout this turbulent period, I maintained a measured and strategic approach. All communications, whether formal filings, responses to company inquiries, or coordination with regulators, were carefully crafted and documented to preserve legal integrity. I refrained from public commentary, focusing instead on advancing the evidence and ensuring procedural correctness. This professionalism reinforced my credibility with all parties involved, including regulators, legal counsel, and corporate stakeholders. The unfolding events demonstrated how a well-documented, systematic approach to uncovering and addressing corporate fraud can trigger a cascade of professional and regulatory consequences. The coordinated legal action, regulatory investigations, and internal audits formed a multi-front pressure mechanism that left Whittaker increasingly isolated and Monroe Technologies scrambling to manage the fallout. This phase marked a crucial turning point. The allegations were no longer whispers behind closed doors. They were formal charges with tangible legal and financial repercussions. The sustained exposure of Whittaker's fraudulent activities through detailed forensic evidence and strategic legal maneuvers effectively dismantled the protective barriers he had relied on. Yet, while these developments signaled progress toward accountability, the battle was far from over. The complex interplay of regulatory review, litigation, and corporate governance would continue to unfold, demanding continued vigilance and strategic responsiveness on my part. The consequences of the unfolding scandal hit Monroe Technologies with remarkable speed and intensity. Within weeks of the formal SEC investigation being announced publicly, the company's board of directors convened an emergency session to address the growing crisis. The findings from the internal audit, a thorough forensic review confirming the $240,000 in fraudulent expense claims, were undeniable, leaving no room for ambiguity. Under mounting pressure from shareholders, regulators, and the public, the board made the decisive move to terminate Martin Whittaker for cause. The official statement cited gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, referencing the detailed audit reports and regulatory correspondence. Whittaker's termination sent shockwaves through the company and the financial markets. Monroe Technologies' stock price immediately reacted to the news, plummeting 12% in the following trading days. Investors' confidence was visibly shaken by the revelations of internal fraud at the executive level and the subsequent leadership upheaval. Analyst reports highlighted significant governance failures and questioned the robustness of Monroe's internal controls, casting uncertainty over the company's immediate financial outlook and long-term credibility. Regulatory penalties soon followed. The SEC imposed fines totaling $350,000 on Monroe Technologies, reflecting the severity of the violations related to inaccurate financial reporting and internal control deficiencies. These fines were accompanied by formal regulatory mandates requiring the company to implement comprehensive remedial measures, including strengthening expense approval processes, enhancing audit trail integrity, and establishing more rigorous compliance monitoring. The company's compliance office was tasked with overseeing these reforms under close regulatory supervision. Beyond the regulatory sphere, Monroe Technologies faced a series of costly lawsuits from investors and shareholders who alleged that the financial misrepresentations had materially affected stock valuations and investment decisions. These class action suits demanded compensation for losses incurred due to the company's failure to disclose accurate financial information in a timely manner. The litigation added significant legal expenses and further strained Monroe's financial resources, compounding the reputational damage triggered by the Whittaker scandal. Whittaker himself suffered profound professional consequences. His CPA license was immediately suspended, pending a disciplinary review by the State Board of Accountancy. The suspension reflected the board's concern over the ethical breaches and fiduciary misconduct revealed by the investigations. Industry peers and professional associations distanced themselves, and Whittaker's prospects for future employment in finance or executive management were effectively curtailed. The suspension notice detailed the nature of the allegations and emphasized the breach of professional standards expected of certified accountants. The scandal's ripple effects extended internally as well. Following comprehensive reviews, additional employees stepped forward with disclosures of irregular practices and procedural lapses that had been overlooked or tolerated during Whittaker's tenure. These new reports prompted further internal investigations, expanding the scope of audit and compliance evaluations. Monroe Technologies' leadership recognized that the cultural and systemic issues enabling such misconduct required deep organizational change, not just personnel adjustments. Industry publications specializing in corporate governance and financial compliance devoted extensive coverage to the case. Articles analyzed the failures in Monroe Technologies' internal controls, HR oversight, and executive accountability. The case became a benchmark example cited in professional forums, conferences, and training sessions as a cautionary tale about the risks of unchecked executive power and inadequate whistleblower protections. The widespread media attention further compounded Monroe's reputational challenges in the marketplace. The financial toll on Whittaker was substantial. Beyond legal fees and regulatory fines personally levied, settlement judgments and damage awards in civil suits exceeded $400,000. These liabilities, coupled with the professional sanctions, underscored the long-term consequences of fraudulent behavior at the executive level. Whittaker's attempts to rehabilitate his career were notably hindered by the public record of misconduct, serving as a stark deterrent to similar conduct in the industry. Human resources also underwent scrutiny. Laura Simmons, the HR manager who had complied without question with Whittaker's termination directive, faced formal reprimand from the company's leadership. The investigation revealed that her failure to initiate proper procedural review and independent inquiry constituted a critical lapse in HR governance. While not implicated in wrongdoing, Simmons' oversight was cited as a contributing factor that allowed the fraud to persist unchecked for so long. Training programs and policy revisions were promptly introduced to reinforce HR's gatekeeper role and prevent future procedural complacency. In response to the magnitude of the crisis, Monroe Technologies embarked on a comprehensive leadership restructuring. New executives with strong backgrounds in compliance and financial integrity were brought in to restore confidence both internally and externally. The company expedited the implementation of enhanced financial controls, including automated expense report validation, multi-tiered approval workflows with immutable audit logs, and independent periodic audits managed by external firms. Whistleblower protections were overhauled to encourage early reporting of irregularities without fear of retaliation, addressing a key vulnerability exposed by this scandal. The combined impact of these measures began to stabilize the company's operations, but the road to full recovery remained complex and ongoing. The entire episode underscored the critical importance of systematic vigilance, robust controls, and a culture that empowers employees at all levels to uphold ethical standards. Whitaker's downfall and the company's enforced reforms illustrated how professional misconduct, when met with methodical, documented exposure and regulatory enforcement, can precipitate significant organizational transformation. At this stage, while the immediate crisis was being managed, it was clear the ramifications would continue unfolding across legal, regulatory, and corporate governance domains. The consequences for all involved had only just begun to crystallize, setting the scene for further developments in accountability and institutional reform. The professional battlefield remained active, with momentum grounded firmly in the meticulous evidentiary foundation laid months earlier. The culmination of this protracted ordeal came during the civil court proceedings, where the judicial system formally acknowledged the validity and strength of the evidence we had painstakingly assembled. The court awarded me $180,000 in back pay, recognizing the wrongful nature of my termination and the financial impact of being abruptly removed from my role. This sum represented lost wages and benefits accrued during the period between my dismissal and the court's ruling, underscoring the tangible professional and economic harm caused by the retaliatory firing. In addition to back pay, the court granted $120,000 in damages. These damages were not punitive in the traditional sense, but rather compensatory, reflecting the professional harm, reputational damage, and emotional strain inherent in being publicly humiliated and unjustly dismissed. The judgment acknowledged that the calculated nature of the firing, staged at the Halloween party to intimidate and discredit me, warranted a remedy beyond simple wage recovery. This financial recognition was an important validation of the principle that professional integrity should never be sacrificed to conceal fraud or abuse of power. Critically, full vesting of my previously unvested stock options was also awarded. These options, part of a long-term incentive program with Monroe Technologies, had been abruptly frozen upon my termination. The court recognized that withholding these equity awards was an indirect form of retaliation and a barrier to rightful compensation. Restoring these options not only provided a substantial financial benefit, but also symbolized acknowledgement of my contributions and rightful claim to the company's growth, further reinforcing the principle that wrongful termination cannot negate earned rights. Parallel to the civil litigation outcome, regulatory actions against Monroe Technologies intensified. The Securities and Exchange Commission imposed cumulative fines totaling $350,000. These fines were levied due to documented violations of financial reporting standards, internal control inadequacies, and failure to disclose material information related to the fraudulent expenses. The SEC's final order detailed the nature of the violations, emphasizing that the company's compliance deficiencies allowed the fraudulent scheme to persist, undetected, for an extended period. The regulatory penalties served as a financial and reputational sanction, compelling Monroe Technologies to undertake substantive reforms in governance and reporting practices. Whitaker himself faced severe professional repercussions beyond the legal and regulatory arenas. His CPA license was suspended pending a disciplinary review conducted by the State Board of Accountancy. The suspension process scrutinized his breaches of fiduciary duty, ethical violations, and deliberate financial misstatements. This professional sanction effectively barred him from practicing as a certified accountant, a credential central to his career and standing in the financial community. The suspension notice cited specific case details, underscoring the gravity of his misconduct and setting a precedent in regulatory enforcement of ethical standards. Adding to Whitaker's professional downfall, numerous employees came forward voluntarily, with additional disclosures regarding irregular transactions and procedural lapses that had been overlooked or tacitly permitted under his CFO tenure. These testimonies expanded the scope of internal investigations and revealed systemic issues in Monroe Technologies' finance and compliance departments. The wave of internal reporting exposed cultural and structural flaws that extended beyond Whitaker's individual actions, highlighting the necessity for deep organizational change to restore trust and accountability. The fallout also reverberated in industry circles. Corporate governance and financial compliance publications extensively covered the case, analyzing the failures in internal controls, HR oversight, and executive accountability that allowed the fraud to occur. These detailed exposés transformed the case into a cautionary exemplar used in forums, professional seminars, and compliance training sessions. The widespread dissemination of the case details enhanced industry awareness of the risks posed by inadequate whistleblower protections and unchecked executive authority, contributing to broader sectoral improvements in governance practices. From a financial perspective, the cumulative legal fees, regulatory fines, and settlement judgments against Whitaker exceeded $400,000. These figures did not include reputational damage or the intangible costs associated with career loss and professional discredit. The monetary sanctions reinforced the message that fraudulent conduct at the executive level carries significant personal and financial consequences, serving as a deterrent to similar unethical behavior within the industry. Within Monroe Technologies, the human resources manager, Laura Simmons, received formal reprimand for procedural failures during the initial dismissal process. The company's internal investigations revealed that her uncritical compliance with Whitaker's termination directive, without conducting an independent review or engaging with relevant policies, constituted a breach of HR governance responsibilities. While not implicated in the fraud itself, Simmons's oversight highlighted the essential role of HR as a gatekeeper for due process and employee protections. In response, Monroe Technologies implemented targeted training programs and revised procedural manuals to reinforce HR accountability and prevent recurrence of such lapses. In the aftermath, Monroe Technologies undertook significant leadership restructuring. New executives with demonstrated expertise in compliance, audit integrity, and ethical governance were appointed to key positions, signaling a commitment to cultural renewal and operational rigor. The company accelerated implementation of enhanced financial controls, including automated workflows with immutable audit trails, strengthened segregation of duties, and regular external audits by independent firms. These systemic reforms addressed previously exploited vulnerabilities and aligned Monroe Technologies with best practices in corporate governance. Crucially, whistleblower protections within the company were overhauled. New policies encouraged timely reporting of irregularities, with explicit guarantees against retaliation and assured confidential handling of complaints. These changes fostered an environment where employees could raise concerns without fear, addressing a critical deficiency exposed by the case. The company also established clearer lines of accountability across finance, HR, and compliance departments, ensuring that no single individual could circumvent controls without detection. Together, these outcomes represented a multifaceted reckoning, legal, regulatory, professional, and cultural, that reshaped Monroe Technologies' governance framework and set a precedent for accountability. The case underscored the power of meticulous documentation, strategic legal action, and professional integrity in confronting executive misconduct. Yet, as these developments unfolded, it was clear that the full ramifications would continue to evolve, both for the individuals involved and for the company's ongoing efforts to restore trust and operational excellence. Today, I serve as a senior forensic consultant at a prominent Fortune 500 company, a role that not only leverages the full breadth of my forensic accounting expertise, but also offers a significant advancement in both compensation and professional responsibility. My current position includes equity participation, reflecting the company's commitment to aligning long-term incentives with performance and integrity, something I value deeply given my experiences. The 25% increase in salary compared to my previous role at Monroe Technologies is a tangible acknowledgement of the specialized skills and strategic judgment I bring to complex financial investigations and compliance projects. Reflecting on the journey that began with that public firing at the Halloween party, the lessons I've internalized are as much about professional discipline as technical proficiency. First and foremost, the importance of rigorous, methodical documentation cannot be overstated. Throughout my career, and especially during the ordeal with Monroe, maintaining detailed audit trails, whether through encrypted email backups, time-stamped ERP logs, or contemporaneous notes, proved essential in constructing an unassailable case. It's this commitment to evidence-based analysis that transformed a potentially career-ending setback into a platform for professional vindication and growth. Moreover, understanding employment contract nuances and the legal framework surrounding whistleblower protections fortified my strategic approach. Early consultation with legal counsel ensured that every action I took was supported by contractual rights and aligned with regulatory statutes, shielding me from retaliatory tactics and maximizing leverage. This intersection of accounting expertise and legal strategy demonstrated that professional competence extends beyond number crunching. It requires an integrated grasp of governance, compliance, and labor law. Throughout the process, patience and measured response were vital assets. The temptation to react emotionally to public humiliation was substantial, yet I recognized that impulsive retaliation would undermine credibility and jeopardize the integrity of the evidence. Instead, I maintained a professional demeanor, responding factually, preserving procedural channels, and letting the documented truth unfold systematically. This controlled approach reinforced my reputation as a reliable and principled professional, ultimately attracting the interest of my current employer. Importantly, the entire episode reaffirmed my belief in the power of systematic justice over impulsive confrontation. By strategically harnessing internal controls, regulatory oversight, and legal mechanisms, I was able to dismantle a sophisticated fraud without compromising my professional standing. The experience underscored that sustaining integrity in the workplace demands not only technical skill but also resilience, foresight, and a commitment to process. In practical terms, this means that my current work emphasizes proactive risk assessment and strengthening organizational controls to prevent the very vulnerabilities I encountered at Monroe. I advise clients on embedding robust audit trails, enhancing whistleblower policies, and fostering cultures that support transparency and ethical conduct. The professional transformation I underwent has broadened my impact. Beyond identifying misconduct, I now help build systems that make such misconduct far less feasible. Looking back, that Halloween party, so carefully orchestrated as a public spectacle to humiliate me, became the defining moment of my career. What could have been a defeat instead crystallized my professional identity and validated the years of meticulous work I had invested. It was a stark reminder that reputation, once publicly challenged, can be restored and even strengthened through disciplined, evidence-based action. Today's role is not just a new job. It is the culmination of strategic perseverance, professional rigor, and an unwavering commitment to ethical standards. The experience has deepened my appreciation for the intricate balance between technical expertise, legal insight, and personal composure, qualities that I now deploy daily to safeguard organizations and hold executives accountable. Ultimately, my story illustrates that measured patience combined with exhaustive documentation and an understanding of legal protections can convert adversity into opportunity. The systematic pursuit of justice, tempered by professionalism, remains the most effective strategy for overcoming wrongful actions in the corporate world. And that, more than anything, has become my guiding principle moving forward.